dealing with the topic of eternal principles of governance. I wanted to look in the writings of Ellen White, her book Patriarchs and Prophets, to emphasize once again the idea that it was a sin for Israel to ask for a king. It was a sin for them to desire an overly centralized government with unchecked power in the hands of a king. And it is a dangerous thing to do because human beings have a sinful nature. So whenever you have an overly centralized government and a person or people with unchecked power in a position of authority, it is a recipe for disaster because by nature we suffer from pride. Well, let's take a look at what she writes here in chapter 59, First King of Israel. And it says in this chapter that the Lord foresaw that Israel would desire a king. Now let's go back a little bit before we read that. It says, government of Israel was administered in the name and by the authority of God. The work of Moses, of the 70 elders, of the rulers and judges. So right here we see the layered government that ancient Israel had originally. There you have Moses, who the Bible says was a humble person according to the book of Numbers 12:3. And then you have the 70 elders, and then you have the rulers and the judges. But then it says, was simply to enforce the laws that God had given. So again, we're dealing with eternal principles God had given. They had no authority to legislate for the nation. In other words, they were not to make up their own ideas and laws. They were not to do that. This was and continued to be the condition of Israel's existence as a nation. From age to age, men inspired by God were sent to instruct the people and to direct in the enforcement of the laws. However, it goes on to say that the Lord foresaw that Israel would desire a king, but he did not consent to a change in the principles upon which the state was founded. So God knew that they would desire a king. It wasn't his idea for them, but they chose to have a king. And God foresaw this. And so when we look in the book of Deuteronomy, when we look in Deuteronomy chapter 17, we see principles governing kings. But we just look there a little bit and we turn down there to verse number 17. And what do we see right there? Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Well, which king did that? Solomon. And how many wives did David have before him? So these principles were violated pretty early on, sadly enough. And like I said, it was the kings that eventually led the nation into apostasy, the nations of Israel and Judah. Yes, there were some good kings, mostly in Judah, but ultimately this was a dangerous office to have of centralized, unchecked power in the hands of a person. It was a recipe for disaster. And so continuing here, it said, the king was to be the vice regent of the Most High. God was to be recognized as the head of the nation, and his law was to be enforced as the supreme law of the land. When the Israelites first settled in Canaan, they acknowledged the principles of the theocracy, and the nation prospered under the rule of Joshua. Now, this is before they had kings. But increase of population and intercourse with other nations brought a change. So this desire for centralizing power, for having a king, for setting up a monarchy, came from the influence of other nations. The people adopted many of the customs of their heathen neighbors and thus sacrificed to a great degree their own simplicity, their own peculiar holy character. Gradually, they lost their reverence for God and ceased to prize the honor of being his chosen people, attracted by the pomp and display of heathen monarchs. So they were attracted by the pomp and display of heathen monarchs. They tired of their own simplicity. Jealousy and envy sprang up between the tribes. Internal dissensions made them weak. They were continually exposed to the invasion of their heathen foes, and the people were coming to believe coming to believe that in order to maintain their standing among the nations, the tribe must be united under a strong central government. That was the mistake that they made, a strong central government of unchecked power, and thus they forfeited their previous system of layered government of checks and balances. Let's take a look, because when we look in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see here, starting in verse 7, let's go back a little bit. And it says in verse 4, Then the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And then it says, But the thing displeased Samuel. It displeased Samuel. It was wrong for them to ask for a king, when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done, since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. You see, and so in other words, instead of government being there to serve the people would be there to serve the government. They would all be serving the king. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. He will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants. You will be his servants, and you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So in other words, they were putting faith in man instead of God. They were turning away from inspired, timeless, eternal principles and going after conventional knowledge.